Jeff Robbins, today's guest, is a partner at Saul Ewing, who was twice appointed by President Bill Clinton to serve as the United States delegate to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. A former U.S. attorney, he's also a syndicated columnist. He'll share insights about his work and his superpower. I'm your host, Devin Thorpe. Welcome to the Superpowers for Good show, where we empower you. Jeff, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. It's just a thrill to connect with you.
I'm elated at the invitation. Thank you so much, Devin.
Well, you and I had an interesting experience in Israel recently. You and I were both guests of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. And I think one of the remarkable things that we experienced was as a couple of middle-aged white guys being among a group where we were the minority in the group. It was a fascinating, wonderful experience. How did you feel about that visit and the group we were with?
Exactly as you say. For me, I've been to Israel a whole bunch of times. For me, the experience was being with 5 people of color, very forceful, very smart, very sensitive, very engaged, to put it mildly, on issues of race and identity and gender, talking about it, observing it, and the chance to overhear what they say, what they said, listen to their observations, listen to their passions, listen to their criticisms, was for me, and it sounds so trite, really humbling. I came away really moved by that part of the experience more than anything, I think. And for me, it was entirely new, I'm humiliated to report.
Yeah. I am so rarely in that situation of being a minority in the room. And, it's happened. I've been to Ethiopia and, a bunch of places in Africa. And I'm kind of, sometimes in a small group of white people. And so it wasn't the first, but it was so wonderful to be just enmeshed for a week with a group of great, extraordinary people of a different perspective. I just loved every minute of it. Just loved every minute of it.
I came away, I think, like you, just powerfully affected by having my eyes opened. There's no more clever phrase for it. My eyes were opened in many respects to how they saw things. And they saw things very powerfully, very passionately, very pointedly, and they expressed themselves about it. And I did a lot of shaking of my head and thinking and soul searching. And I came away thinking, boy, shame on me for having taken so long to even put myself in a situation where I was able to see and observe all that through their eyes.
Yeah. It was, I just loved every minute of that association. Jeff, you've done some amazing things. President Clinton appointed you a couple of times to the Human Rights Commission?
Yes, it was the Human Rights Commission. And now in a triumph of UN reform and bureaucratic soul searching, they have now renamed themselves the Human Rights Council. So that's a terrifically substantive reform. You can imagine all the impact.
Yeah.
And Devin, I have to say, I don't want to brag, but the Human Rights Commission, now council, meets for 6 weeks a year. And just so you know the kinds of achievement that I had in that capacity in 99 and 2000, it turns out that I set a record for the most hors d'oeuvres consumed by anybody in the history of the State Department in the 6-week category, 2 years running. So you're talking to somebody with a lot of bona fides.
Jeff, you're amazing. So, you had been working, I think, prior to that in the U.S. Senate, and so developed a network in Washington. But tell us a little bit about your experiences, past hors d'oeuvres with the Human Rights Commission / Council.
Experiences at the council or before that?
Yeah, with it. Yeah.
Well, so the United States has a tradition of appointing 4 so-called public delegates from outside the Foreign Service, from outside the State Department, to attend the Human Rights Commission. And the idea, I think, was originated with Eleanor Roosevelt when the UN was founded. The idea was that there should be some expression of the American public at the council. And so the White House appoints 4 or 5 people a year and to go. And I have to say it was moving. I mean, on one level, of course, the UN is full of bloviation and nonsense and almost, Monty Python-like silliness in terms of the rhetoric and the meaningless falderall. There is all that, but there's also a tremendous amount of idealism. The council every year is attended by hundreds of activists and refugees and victims and advocates for victims. And as a delegate for the United States being the 800-pound gorilla, there is actually opportunity to speak out on their behalf and to lend support to their various causes. And these are stories, some of them too long to tell today, but there were numerous times in those 2 6-week stints when I thought, my God, how wonderful to represent the United States. And with everything that we've got going that's problematic, what a wonderful thing the United States is at its best as an advocate for people, for those whose human rights are not being respected. And so I came away with it all very much moved by the opportunity to speak at the UN on behalf of the United States, and probably more substantively to kind of advocate a bit for various human rights organizations and individuals around the world.
This was not long after. I think it was not the year that, but I believe it was not long after Hillary Clinton rather famously spoke at, I believe it was a UN human rights convening in China, where she gave the now famous, one of the most famous lines she or anyone has ever delivered, right? But she said, women's rights are human rights. How did that discussion that she started, or at least advanced with that speech, how was that being discussed when you were there in the shadow of that great moment?
Well, I will tell you, I remember quite vividly, this is 1999 and 2000, the last 2 years of the Clinton administration, the American ambassador to the Human Rights Commission, the Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights, who was out there for much of the 6 weeks, Harold Koh, they were very cognizant of what Hillary wanted and Hillary's influence. She wielded a lot of influence on what the American position was at the Human Rights Commission, and I'm sure at other UN bodies. So she was very much respected within the United States government, as you might imagine it being the Clinton administration, and she played a very non-passive, let's call it that, role in pushing people in terms of what they said, what they did, and who we allied with. In addition, of course, she and the Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, were very close. So she had influence on those kinds of issues beyond that which I think most people appreciate.
Yeah. Well, it is fun to connect with you and chat about that amazing experience. Of course, one of the things that you have done now, you're a lawyer, you're full time at Saul Ewing as a litigator, but you also write a syndicated column, and the sense of humor that you have demonstrated already today is on evidence in your columns. It's I also see your brilliance in other ways, right? You are very deft with the pen. So tell us a little bit about some of the things that are important to you that you like to write about, challenge people to think about.
Well, you're unbelievably generous and beyond generous. But it's awfully kind of you to say these things. One of the papers that I write for is the Boston Herald, and the Boston Herald is the more conservative, let's put it that way, of the two Boston newspapers, the other one being the Globe. And I think it's fair to say that maybe the attraction for me, for the Herald, of having my column is nothing about brilliance and nothing about deafness, but merely that, okay, they have somebody who is not necessarily, right off the dock at Nuremberg. And the readers, I think, don't love me a great deal. So there is the experience every week with that newspaper. You're right, it's syndicated, but with that newspaper, of waking up on Tuesday mornings and seeing, various versions of why don't you go back to where you came from, wherever that's supposed to be. And I actually feel as though you asked what I like writing about. I'm so appalled by Donald Trump. I'm so appalled by Trumpism. I'm so appalled by all of the viciousness and the brutality and the swagger and the corruption and the anti-democratic instincts, to be quite blunt about it, in my view, of the last 5 years of that movement, that even though I know that there will be people, lots of people, in fact, most of the Herald's readers, who will be enraged by that, I feel an obligation to go right at that. And so I think in some perverse way, perhaps I shouldn't admit this, I actually like going right at that stuff in a newspaper where I know the readers will just detest me and cast aspersions on my mother. And
That's brave. That's brave. It takes a lot of courage to do that. I think sometimes it's easy for those of us who don't like that to think that that's easy, but it's hard to get.
Well, can I tell you a quick
constant
story?
criticism? Please.
The story is that, I don't know, it's been 3 years ago when the children in these cages at the border was disclosed, and I wrote a column about it. And I'm used on Tuesday mornings to having waking up and seeing comments that are just, cast aspersions on my family, my religion, the size of my head, you name it. I never thought there was anything interesting about the size of my head, but some people apparently feel differently. But on this particular morning, I woke up and to all of those comments were added a comment. Somebody had posted our address, our street address. So I called up the editor-in-chief of the Boston Herald, whom I know, and I said, Joe, listen, before I go down to Home Depot and buy a machine gun nest, I wonder if you wouldn't mind taking this off the website. And he laughed, and he did. And he said, on principle, I think people should probably have their own machine gun nest these days, but there we are. And about 20 minutes later, somebody, that's the person who evidently was kicked off of the site, sent triumphantly a link where he had outdone himself. He had reposted the address, but he'd added to it a picture of our home taken from the street with a picture of my wife and I superimposed in front of our front door. And a picture of people who were supposed to be Hispanic, I guess, saying a family, and a note saying, how many Mexicans live with you, Jeff? So it's interesting the way people react. I was aggravated. My wife was absolutely appalled at the fact that they had posted her picture of her with her eyes closed. And I said, Joanne, I think that you're missing the point here. I don't think that's the principal.
The principal objectionable feature of this.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my gosh.
Anyway, there we are.
What that is a scary implication. Just really, I'm glad that you're safe and well, apparently. But Jeff, as you think about all you've done in your extraordinary career, what do you see as your superpower?
Well, again, you are so thoughtful and kind and flattering, and nobody likes inaccurate flattery more than I do. I will say something maybe a little bit contrarian, which is that I actually think that the nuts and bolts of stuff is what matters. You are somebody who has achieved an enormous amount by paying attention to detail, by sweating the small stuff. I know that it's popular to say, don't sweat the small stuff. Unless you're a genius, and I am very, very far from that, there's nothing to be done but to sweat the small stuff. I sometimes think that, there's a direct line between neurosis and excellence. Neurosis is no guarantee of excellence, God knows, as I think I demonstrate on an hourly basis. But on the other hand, unless you're a genius, the excellence does not come without the neurosis, without the blocking and the tackling and the reading of things and the paying attention to details. So I actually think that the boring stuff is what matters most. And if you skip the quote unquote boring stuff, the chances of succeeding at whatever it is you're trying to do, are much slimmer. In the practice of law, for example, where in a big firm where the cases are big and there are a lot of documents, I always had to laugh because people would talk about, well, document review. Let's just give the document review to, some junior people or some paralegals. Just let them do. And I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about, man. It's the documents that are the evidence. The evidence is going to be in some footnote someplace.
Right.
If you don't look at the damn documents, including the footnotes, you're not going to get the evidence. And you don't get the evidence, you don't win the case. That to me is an example of how there are not, in my experience, any shortcuts. Unfortunately, it's the slog that makes the difference, if you see what I mean.
Oh yeah. I think this superpower of sweating the small stuff is incredibly insightful. And you're right. I've been asking this question of my guests for 5 years, and this is a new one. And yet I can see the extraordinary power of what you're talking about conceptually. Can you think of a specific example you're allowed to share with us that wouldn't violate client confidentiality or some other oath, where you can say, yeah, this is the detail here had a big impact because I paid attention to it?
Well, I think it happens all the time, frankly, in the practice of law, especially litigation, whereas you can imagine, you can think that you've looked at documents or that other people have looked at documents and they have told you they've looked at documents. And you can say, okay, check documents. Somebody told me documents looked at. And that is a prescription for losing. In my experience, perhaps I'm just slow on the uptake. In fact, I'm surely slow on the uptake. I have to stick my face in documents and read them many times. And all the time it's the case that I catch stuff, including, I think the dirty little secret is for litigators, at the end of the case rather than at the beginning, when you are standing in court and about to examine a witness and you look at some document and see, wait a second, that person said the opposite there of what he is professing now. And therefore you cross-examine that person with that document. And it's something that you never would have seen had you not read the damn document over and over and over again. That happens as frequently as sands that are on the seashore. It happened to me, quite frankly, last week while I was examining a witness. And I looked down at a document that I had worked on, and I saw for the first time there was an entry on a legal bill, which was a piece of evidence that showed something important. And I thought, well, my split second reaction was, goodness, this probably isn't the best time to have noticed this, but no one has noticed this before. And here we are standing in court and I've noticed it. That happens to lawyers, I think, way more than they like to say. But the bottom line on all of it is you don't spend the time as a litigator looking at the evidence, scouring it, turning it around, reading it at different times during the course of the case, because of course things occur to you differently as a case progresses. You're going to miss that stuff. There's no shortcut for that. There's no way around that. There's no clever Perry Mason skill that can substitute anything, or even close to substitute, for sticking your face down in the paper and reading the damn stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great example. Now, there are a lot of people, including, I imagine, a lot of lawyers you work with, that don't want to do that, right? They want to let someone else do that. But and sometimes we can let someone else do that. But oftentimes, I think to your point, that sweating the small stuff is our job. How would you coach people to do it better, to take it on in those times when no one else is going to do it and it has to be done?
Well, in the case, a couple of things. First of all, my wife, thank God, is hugely indulgent, because there have been times when I have come home with bankers boxes full of paper, and this is nothing to be proud of, but I mean, and Post-its, and I basically take out documents and write, which I think is not necessarily the most technologically efficient way to do it, but I need to do it that way. In the case of small, and I want to see what's in the emails. I want to see what's in the damn paper. And it's made a difference constantly. In the case of younger lawyers, I think you make a very good point. I think that with all the technology at their disposal, they're used to kind of whipping around. So for example, when they have to write something, they'll say, well, I'll just take this section from this and I'll slide that over there and I'll move that over here and I'll whisk that over here. And that's not the same. And you as a writer of great skill know this. That's not the same as crafting something or thinking about it. I remember one young lawyer said to me, this is now 25 years ago, 30 years ago. Yeah, I'll crank something out about that. And I remember hearing the phrase, crank it out. And I basically, the blood drained from every part of my body, because it's like, that's not what we do, is crank stuff out. I can't crank stuff out. I'd love to be able to crank stuff out. I am not a cranker. I think you have to craft stuff when you write it. And the same way, when you're looking at evidence, I sort of say, listen, you may just be a first or second or third year lawyer. I don't care. This is your case. You have to think of yourself as responsible for drilling down and thinking about everything, and how can we use this piece of evidence, and what other things should we do? That's not, as you imply by your question, that's not always welcome from young lawyers. Sometimes it is, because they know they have to do that. But there are some people who, for one reason or another, find that, drudgery. Again, I don't know any alternative to embracing the drudgery.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, that's a really profound insight, and I'm so grateful. I'm grateful for all I learned from you. But I will never forget the lesson of not sweating the small stuff as a superpower you shared today, Jeff. Before we wrap up, and I'm so grateful that you take the time to be with me, would you take just a minute and tell people how they can connect with you, how they can find how they can find you at the law firm at Saul Ewing? Tell them how they can find your column at the Boston Herald, how they can maybe find you on social media, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, that's so nice of you. So in no particular order, my email address is Jeffrey, Jeffrey, Robbins, Robbins, at Saul, SAUL.com. The name of the firm is Saul Ewing, SAULEWING. The column is published every week on the Creators Syndicate, which is www.creators.com. And then my telephone number is 617-912-0941. And I'm, of course, very happy to hear from anybody who is associated with you in any way, shape, or form. I admire what you do a great deal.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for taking the time to be with you. It's great to hear some of your old stories. Great to reconnect after our visit to Israel. And I want to wish you every success in your work as a columnist, as a thought leader, as a lawyer. We want to see you succeed and prosper.
Thank you, Devin. Thank you so much for the invitation.
All righty. Let's do some good.
Thank you for tuning in to the Superpowers for Good show. Twice each week, we host changemakers who share their impact, insights, and superpowers. Don't miss another episode. Subscribe today at superpowersforgood.com. That's superpowers, good.com. Be super empowered. Get your copy of the book, Superpowers for Good, as an ebook, audiobook, paperback, or hardcover edition via your favorite online retailer. Interested in having me speak to your company, organization, or association? Visit devinthorpe.com. Then let's talk. Now, keep using your superpowers for good. Together, we can reverse climate change, improve global health, and eradicate poverty.